Good evening. I'm Andy Yan, and I'm the director of the City program at Simon Fraser University. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation, Housing or Commodity, the Transformation of Housing and Its Discontent. I was hoping that folks can kind of further smush together and densify. Everybody seemed to have showed up today. Remember, it was a Tuesday after a long weekend, and thank you for coming. I'd like to begin with the acknowledgement that this event is occurring on the unceded indigenous land belonging to the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Before we continue, just a few housekeeping announcements. The intake for the upcoming year's City program certificates in urban design and community data science are now open, and as well as our new classes in design thinking for community engagement and empowerment. So, as always, information about our forthcoming classes in the City program are going to be available at sfu.ca/city. It is a tremendous pleasure to present tonight with the Housing Research Collaborative at the University of British Columbia, and that this event would not be possible without the generous sponsorship of BC Housing. The agenda tonight is a talk by Professor Madden, followed by a panel of local respondents and a question period hosted by Star Vancouver's City Hall and housing reporter Jen St Denis. Questions can be submitted via Slido. That is the kind of posting that we have on the slides, Slido, and with the code HOME, #HOME. And as such, of course, we move on to our subject matter. Housing seems to be the Gordian knot of our city region. Tonight, the City program presents some perspectives in the areas of housing research and public policy. But these, of course, are not the only voices, as this is a topic through which are affecting any number of communities, from the indigenous population to young families with children to new immigrants and many, many others. However, it is in this topic that has generated much heat in metropolitan Vancouver that we here tonight will hopefully generate some light. And our speaker tonight is David Madden, who is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also the co-director of the City's program at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So a special welcome to the City program's British cousins. that in 2016, Professor Madden with urban planner Peter Marcuse wrote the book In Defense of Housing, the Politics of Crisis. They looked at the causes and consequences of the housing problem and in detail that the need for progressive alternatives in the United States as well as globally. The housing crisis cannot be resolved by minor policy shifts, they argue. Rather, the housing crisis has deep political and economic roots and therefore requires a radical response. Locally, William Dunn, a reviewer for the Vancouver edition of Spacing magazine, in his February 2017 review writes in his review in his book, for those who want a relatively brief overview of the root causes of our housing crisis and what needs to be done to end it, In Defense of Housing is a must read. And so it's in this review and the urgency to perhaps pick up this book at your local bookseller, and I particularly would recommend Pulp Fiction or Spartacus books, that I would like to invite David Madden to the stage. Thank you.
Hold on. Let me rearrange things. Great. Thank you. Hello. It is it's great to be here. Thank you. I just want to start by thanking Andy for organizing this event and for the invitation, and to thank Jen, Penny, and David for speaking at this as well, and to thank all of you for showing up here tonight. There's a lot of interest in this topic because this is a problem that we're all living. Housing is a unique type of problem that is hiding in plain sight. Everyone seems to know that the housing system in most big cities is in crisis. This is not a secret. This is a problem that households are living every day. And if you walk around any big city, the symptoms are obvious. In London, where I live, there's been a 25% rise in street homelessness in the past year alone. In New York City, where I used to live, more than half of the tenants cannot afford the rent. And here in Vancouver, between the unoccupied towers, the unaffordable houses, and the large numbers of people marginalized or expelled from the housing system, it's obvious that something is deeply wrong. If you open any newspaper these days, this problem is staring you in the face. Newspapers are filled with stories like these about federal workers in Washington, D.C. living in tents, homeless families moved into dangerous office conversions in the suburbs of London, tenants in Vancouver being harassed by repeated eviction notices. We've almost become inured to stories like this, even as we remain fascinated by it as well. And we have this stance towards the terrible housing news, maybe a bit like the way that in Britain we read the news about Brexit, or the way people read news about terrible weather, as this problem that you feel powerless in order to address, but you can't look away. But these cities, in some ways, are places of incredible wealth and resources. A few months ago, a single flat in New York City sold for $238 million. And in London, sales of houses worth over £10 million have tripled since the 2016 Brexit referendum. So this is a highly uneven situation where residential suffering coexists with unprecedented luxury. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. And that's what I hope we can address in this panel. Why are contemporary cities and societies simultaneously producing unnecessary amounts of unaffordable luxury housing and destroying necessary amounts of affordable and social housing? So I think in order to answer this question, we need to sharpen the concepts that we use to discuss and understand housing. We need to talk about what and who housing is for. As I said, this is a problem that is hiding in plain sight. We're all familiar with the basic facts about the housing problem. And planners like Andy, Penny, David, and many others have done amazing work visualizing the extent of housing dispossession and housing injustice here and in cities across the world. And I mean, I think our problem now is cutting through the ideological fog in order to think clearly about how housing and urbanism are changing and what to do about it. So tonight I want to see what political sense we can make out of the housing crisis and try to understand its place within contemporary urban capitalism. So to that end, I'll be discussing some of the arguments that Peter Marcuse and I make in our book, In Defense of Housing. Now this book is about the housing question today in the broadest sense. We largely discuss New York City, where Peter and I both used to live. Tonight I'll also be discussing London, where I currently live, but we're trying to use the housing history of these cities as a way to talk about the role of housing in today's neoliberal urban capitalist societies more broadly. And later on, we'll discuss how some of these processes are unfolding in their specific ways here in Vancouver. But it's clear that the housing crisis is global in scope. London, New York, Vancouver, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Toronto, Sydney, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Lagos, big cities across the world are facing a ubiquitous set of residential struggles. Households are being squeezed by the cost of living, homelessness and overcrowding are on the rise. Evictions, foreclosures, displacement, and unaffordability have become the hallmarks of today's cities. Around the world, land grabs, forced evictions, and expulsions are rampant. According to the UN, the homeless population across the planet may be anywhere between 100 million and 1 billion people, depending on how homelessness is defined. So this means that across the planet, there are currently, right now, something like 330 million households unable to find a decent or affordable home. Now, it's obviously the case that the housing problem is not identical in every city. But I want to argue that they have a common root, and perhaps they can be addressed using a common global strategy. So let's start with a very basic question. What is housing for? What is the purpose of housing? At first glance, this seems like it should be obvious. And the fact that the question, what is housing for, is even intelligible speaks to a particular condition that characterizes contemporary urban life. Housing, we might imagine, is for living. But I think this understates the set of social purposes and political projects connected to housing. Housing is always more than just housing. It provides shelter and serves as the spatial setting for family and community life, but it fulfills other functions as well. It is the precondition for any economic activity, because it is the site for the social reproduction of labor, where workers return to every evening in order to recuperate and work again the next day. It is a social resource and political tool. It's no coincidence that housing is key to national mythologies and ideologies like the American dream or its cognates elsewhere. Housing is essentially the spatial and territorial correlate of full citizenship and bears all of its attendant contradictions. So Peter and I argue that the residential is political, which is to say that if you want to understand why the housing system looks the way it does, you need to analyze concrete social struggles and how they shape residential and urban space. So to say that the residential is political is to say that struggles over dwelling space are inextricable from conflicts over power, resources, autonomy, and agency. Housing is not only a question of who occupies what building, and it is not only shaped by the direct interest of housing suppliers in pursuit of profit. Rather, it's decisively shaped by all of the inequalities of market society. Housing systems are formed by conflicts between classes, institutions, and the state. Residential space is used by these groups in struggles with one another. So I think we need to, in order to sort of reset our thinking about housing, we need to try to sort of go back to political and conceptual first principles here. The specific functions of the housing system vary historically. So different eras and places have seen different connections between housing and citizenship, different interfaces between housing and inequality, different relationships between housing and market mechanisms, and different groups accessing different locations in evolving housing hierarchies. And my position is that today we are seeing a broad transformation in the function of housing. I mean, the function and purpose of housing has changed a lot through history, and I think we're witnessing a major shift right now. Housing today is increasingly not being created and distributed in order to provide people with homes. Instead, a different set of purposes is emerging. For example, housing today is being converted into a liquid, digitally mediated tool for speculation. It's becoming a global-scaled object for investment. It's becoming a method for tax evasion, money laundering, and the consolidation of illegal assets. It functions as a way for globally mobile elites to purchase citizenship, rights, and security. In other words, housing today serves as a resource for the privileged few who control particular types of it, and a tool for the repression and removal of many others. Housing has never been universally available or equally distributed, it should be said. But the current situation, where housing is a globally circulating commodity, is historically unprecedented. As housing systems around the world are increasingly oriented towards these new functions, their ability to meet the social needs for inhabitable space becomes strained. So that, I think, is the crux of the housing question today. And so we need to try and understand how this is happening and why. So I think that we can make some sense of this transformation in housing using the concept of commodification. So let's take a moment and talk about what we mean with this idea. There are a lot of different ways to understand the idea of a commodity. My work is in the tradition of critical theory and critical sociology, which has a very specific understanding of the concept of the commodity form. So in this literature, the essence of commodification is that the economic value of a thing, anything, comes to predominate relative to all of its other uses. So anything can be commodified. I mean, anything, any specific thing in general has a large and potentially infinite number of uses. But when it is transformed into a commodity, all of these uses become subordinate to a greater or lesser extent to a single function, that of exchange. I think we can see a very clear and straightforward illustration of this concept with this New Yorker cartoon. Commodification is, in essence, the process of making someone's worldly possessions equivalent to one gold brick. And the thing about gold bricks is that you can exchange them, but you can't live in them. So the commodification of housing occurs when the economic value of housing becomes relatively more important than the social uses of housing. So that is, the commodification of housing is when housing's existence as real estate comes to dominate its ability to function as home. That is, I argue, increasingly what we're seeing today in cities across the world. Not only the commodification, but indeed the hyper-commodification of housing. Now, this is, this can be seen in many ways, which I'll discuss in a second. But you know, we're used to sort of understanding this through the measure of the cost of housing and housing prices, and that is an important dimension to this problem, certainly. But the question of the commodification of housing is not just a matter of housing in particular strategic locations becoming more expensive. It's bigger than that. It's a matter of a deep change within the housing system as a whole. So housing systems are becoming increasingly oriented towards the needs of investors and increasingly unable to meet residential needs. It's a question of shaping what gets built and what doesn't get built, what gets conserved and what gets destroyed within cities, and who gets marginalized and who gets privileged within housing systems. All of these things are sort of shifting within this process of commodification. So we're seeing the reorganization and transformation of housing systems and indeed of urban space as a whole. One of the important facts of this process of commodification is that it occurs at many different scales, as we'll talk about, from the scale of the household up to the scale of the urban region and indeed the planet in some ways, but also down to the scale of the household, in some ways of the room and the sort of micro environments that people occupy. It's important to stress that residential commodification as well is a relative concept. So it refers to a direction of social change, not to a static condition. The question is not, is housing a commodity or not? But the question is, how is it changing? Is it becoming more commodified? So it's a sort of dynamic process that we're looking at. So this is a process of change where housing becomes more oriented towards exchange than it had been previously, where limits on the extent to which housing is being shaped by market logics are being removed. So to understand the ways in which the commodification of housing are playing out today, and to understand the current ascendancy of real estate over home, the domination of real estate over home, we need to take a very brief tour of the history of housing under modern capitalism. Commodification, it is clear, is a variable historical process. For most of human history, housing was not a commodity, and housing was not even an independent sector of economic life. It was bound up with the order of political authority and with the process of labor. So before the 19th century, the idea of the value of housing would have referred to the value of labor carried out within it, or the value of goods produced through its connection to land. You would not have spoken about the value of housing as an independent floating commodity. That just simply would not have made sense. The precondition for the commodification of housing was the enclosure of the commons, the centuries-long process of fencing off common land and transforming it into private property, to alienable property, which consolidated the power of the landed class and created a mass of dispossessed laborers who migrated to cities. What was accomplished in Europe through enclosure was brought to the rest of the world through colonialism, and in the process destroying countless pre-colonial systems of land tenure. But even in early commercial capitalist society, housing was still predominantly shaped by the organization of work rather than produced and exchanged as a commodity in its own right. So if you look at the history of commercial capitalist cities, many houses are internally integrated between home and shop. And urban space itself, the scale of neighborhoods, is also integrated between work and home. Again, none of this is to claim that pre-commodified urban housing or sort of early commodified urban housing or sort of less than complete commodified urban housing was somehow democratic or just. It certainly was not, but it is important to understand the historical specificity of housing as a commodity. What came to be known as the housing question, and it's the name of a famous book by Friedrich Engels, which I highly recommend that everyone reads, and that I assign to my students every year. But it also was the name of a sort of broader discourse floating through late 19th century society. And it referred to the problem of what to do about these districts of residential misery that were emerging within cities as capitalism developed and as housing came to be a commodity. The first period of the expansion of the commodity character of housing was in the late 19th century and early 20th century, as dispossessed laborers are thrown at the mercy of local real estate capitalists. Exploited at work, workers are also facing exploitation at home. Ultimately, capitalism evolves a complex urban geography of residential misery. And it's in late 19th and early 20th century cities that ruling classes first start to understand something which they never fully grasped, and which I think has some bearing on our current situation as well, which is that the housing problem was threatening to undermine the very foundations of urban capitalism itself. Something had to be done about these districts of residential misery that industrial capitalism was creating, otherwise they were going to destroy industrial capitalism. So beginning in the late 19th century, there's this complicated counter-movement that arose to try to negate the most brutal aspects of industrial urban life. All of this reflects decades of struggle on behalf of workers and households. But eventually, in many cities, you see the development of minimum dwelling standards, building codes, design regulations, health inspections, and the beginning of secure tenancies, which are signifying a recognition by the ruling class in cities like New York and London and elsewhere that housing left to the vagaries of market logics constituted a threat to the stability of the system as a whole. So ultimately, many cities came to create islands of partially decommodified housing in the form of social housing, public housing, and highly regulated private housing. Public housing and rent regulation were the most dramatic manifestations of this movement, but ultimately, especially in the post-war period, a whole set of policies emerged that are intended to regulate and support housing systems. Other manifestations of this include state-supported housing finance, state-supported housing associations, and public infrastructure investments. Even the deeply privatized landscapes of American suburbia are deeply supported by government loans, subsidies, and infrastructure investment. Arguably, this is public housing as well. It's just the role of the state in producing these landscapes is generally not recognized. So this period of housing history, or the post-war period to the 1970s, was deeply contradictory. So I won't go into too many more details here, but I do think it's important to not romanticize mid-20th century housing policies. I mean, especially in some corners of Twitter, you see a lot of people sort of romanticizing post-war social democracy in a more general sense. But this is a deeply contradictory political formation and a deeply contradictory historical period. And the housing history of post-war social democracy is also deeply contradictory. I mean, this process of housing reform and of creating these islands of partial decommodification, they, on the one hand, they reflect pressure from tenants and workers to demand better residential conditions. At the same time, they definitely reflect a need to control labor, prevent insurrection, and ensure the functionality of real estate markets. And you can see this very clearly looking at the history of urban renewal of public housing. I mean, it's like you have to sort of keep this contradictory situation in mind when trying to make sense of it. So it is certainly not the utopia that you sometimes sort of see in more nostalgic accounts. But I think that this history does show that even within the confines of capitalist political economies, housing is not automatically commodified and does not need to be. So it's against this backdrop of the partially decommodified housing that characterized this earlier period that I think we can understand the turn towards hyper-commodification today. So if sort of broadly speaking, welfare capitalism saw the sort of partial decommodification and regulation of housing, under neoliberal capitalism we're seeing the hyper-commodification of housing. So the roots of this turn towards the commodity form in the housing sector lie in the 1970s process of welfare state restructuring. So this is something that has unfolded over decades, but has arguably accelerated in the past few decades, and certainly since 2008. And there are different dimensions to this. So I think we can sort of highlight a number of important sides to this process of the commodification of housing. First, there's a very strong element of sweeping away limits to the commodity character of housing. As I said, especially in the post-war period, there was this sort of broad move towards limiting and regulating the role of market logics and the power of market actors within housing sectors. But starting in the 70s with Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and I mean, throughout the world, really, there's this moment of sweeping away limits and of really intentionally making housing more flexible and hence the residential experience more precarious. I say this is both deregulation but also re-regulation because I don't think we should understand this history as the state subtracting itself from the housing sector. It's, I mean, this whole process of commodification and really this whole sort of deeply troubling moment that we find ourselves in has been brought about by state action. I mean, even as states in other ways have been trying to sort of ameliorate some of the problems, but this is even the sort of 1970s moment of neoliberal deregulation was not the state subtracting itself from the housing sector. It was a transformation of what states are doing within the housing sector. So this means rewriting regulations rather than removing them. It means changing the goals of regulation. This process takes different forms in different places according to different political pathways that housing took in different cities. So in New York, the biggest limit to market logic, and there was public housing certainly, but by far the biggest limit to market logic in housing was regulations on rent, which refers to a collection of different policies that go under the name rent control and rent stabilization. By the early 1980s, almost 2/3 of all rented housing units in New York were subject to some form of regulation. So this had been a deeply regulated part of the housing system. But since then, there's been a massive decline in the number of stabilized and regulated units. I mean, there's no question about what's happening with this graph. In London, by contrast, the spatial expression of regulated residential capitalism was council housing. So deregulation here takes the form of privatization through various pathways, including direct stock transfer of just sort of privatizing entire public housing developments, including the so-called right to buy, which refers to sort of a scheme for unit-by-unit privatization, which is one of the sort of centerpieces of Margaret Thatcher's domestic policy. And it takes the form of new policies that greatly restrict the ability of councils to build new housing. So you see that there's been this huge transformation in the structure of housing tenure in London. I mean, this dark area here of housing built by local authorities has essentially just disappeared. It has been disappeared. And there's been virtually no new build council housing in London now. So rather than a sector protected from market forces, the stock of public housing within the city is now seen as a target for speculation and private investment. Essentially, Britain has sold most of what the state possessed at one point, and some of the only things left are the NHS and housing. So now they're looking to sell them. This brings me to the second dimension of commodification, which is financialization. So this is also a more general term from critical social science that people use in many different ways. Financialization, in essence, refers to a process where profit-making in any industry turns towards the servicing and exchanging of money and debt rather than primary production. So it refers to a sort of change in the sort of leading economic direction within an industry or within an economy as a whole, because we've seen the sort of financialization of many global north economies in general. But this also has a political predicate as well. So banks and other financial actors are becoming more powerful. So the financialization of housing then refers to new practices of economic accumulation based on exchanging and servicing credit and debt, as well as the recomposition of real estate capital. So you've got the emergence of new formations of real estate capital. You essentially have the creation of new types of landlords and real estate capitalists. So things that didn't really exist 20 or 30 years ago are now dominating real estate in many places. Private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, other types of financialized firms, banks following newly financialized strategies. These are increasingly central in many cities. Between 2004 and 2008, private equity firms in New York City went on a buying binge and cumulatively purchased 90,000 rent-stabilized apartments in New York City, which is nearly 10% of the total of such units. And the strategy was to take them out of rent stabilization and raise the rents. There was no other strategy beyond that. These are some of the major private equity firms operating in New York City real estate. Financialization as a concept also points to the huge amounts of money that are searching for investment outlets in housing and these new strategies that real estate capitalists adopt. Financialized landlordism follows a very different logic than traditional small-scale landlords, and that their housing strategies tend to be hyper-rationalized. So small-scale landlords may have some kind of social connection to their tenants. They may decide for various reasons not to maximize their rental income. This isn't really a sustainable route for housing security for households, but it does provide some people with affordable housing. But under financialization, soft spaces in the market like this are systematically eliminated. These kinds of inefficiencies become impossible, but of course one person's inefficiency is another person's affordable home. The business plan is to locate these locations in the market and close this rent gap often through highly leveraged deals. And this is something that we're seeing in central city apartments as well as out-of-borough multifamily dwellings, single-family suburban homes. I mean, sort of across housingscapes, we see this process. One private equity firm, Blackstone, boasts that it controls $136 billion worth of assets around the globe. Its various arms and subsidiaries constitute the largest owner of real estate in the US, the largest owner of real estate in Spain, and indeed it claims to be the largest controller of real estate in the world. So we have the emergence of firms like this, which again is historically unprecedented. And this brings me to the last major dimension of the commodification of housing, which is globalization. Now, having foreign owners of housing rather than domestic owners does not necessarily imply commodification. Local investment firms can be just as savage as global ones. The issue is not that housing is being owned by non-citizens, but the globalization of housing does support commodification in a number of ways. So first, since the 1970s, FDI flows in the real estate sector have become much more common. So this means that there's been this huge expansion of foreign ownership in real estate, and this wave of money changes what's profitable to build in many urban locations. It promotes speculation, and as many people have pointed out, it means that housing markets are starting to become more responsive to global economic signals than to local ones, whereas inhabiting a house is always a local phenomenon. I mean, it happens at many scales, but there's always going to be an inescapable locality to the practice of dwelling. And so in this respect, the globalization of housing is contributing to housing becoming more of an object for exchange than a usable site for dwelling. At the same time, and this is not news to anyone sitting in this room, a globally mobile, hyper-wealthy class is using luxury housing as a store for their own resources. And we can probably look out the window and see some examples. As one elite real estate developer put it a few years ago, luxury real estate is now the world's new currency. So he's not saying that luxury real estate can be purchased with currency around the world. Now it is currency itself. This is the gold bar again. Now, as I said, people have occupied and purchased housing across borders before, but the scale and speed through which housing circulates globally today is historically unprecedented. The sort of established pattern was that real estate was the domain of local elites, leveraging their capital, their local connections, in order to sort of play this strategic game of real estate. It was dominated by wealthy families and sort of local captains of industry, but now it's this digitally mediated liquid commodity connected to the rhythms of global investment. Housing scholar Raquel Rolnik describes the territory of what she calls the empire of finance. And within this empire, luxury housing is the official currency. So this is detaching housing from local conditions and making it a target for a wave of money searching for investment. And throughout this process, housing is beginning to change its form, function, and connection to the urban context. So those are the sort of main dimensions of commodification. And as I said, they work out differently in different places. They unfold at many different scales, through many different policies, and they take it, different form in different places, but I think we can identify some commonalities as well. I mean, it's also the case that they do tend towards a certain type of homogeneity. The housingscapes of pre- or decommodified housing tends to be very local and distinct. The housing forms tend to be very local and distinct, and the urban morphologies tend to be very local and distinct. But there's this sort of growing homogeneity as local dwelling types are destroyed and replaced by the global vernacular of speculative housing. So in nearly all big cities, we see both the destruction of residential alternatives and the creation of housing that's increasingly unfit to meet the social need for residential space. Now, why is this particular process happening today? Why are we seeing this process of commodification playing out now? I mean, very briefly, we can say there's been a huge long-term shift within global capitalism where real estate, banking, and finance are becoming more prominent relative to productive capital. So neoliberal capitalism itself is undergoing a process of financialization. And so this is partly reflecting this broader process of change. As I said, we see this sort of huge amount of money that's circulating the globe looking for investment opportunities, and housing and land are seen as some of the safest options. At the same time, the commodification of housing is a political project that's pursued by a variety of actors and institutions for many different reasons. In some cases, it fits with the neoliberal emphasis on austerity and the liberation of market forces. In other cases, it fits with the more traditionally conservative emphasis on private home ownership as a cornerstone of social order. But in all cases, the commodification of housing should not be seen as a purely economic process. It is political in its nature and consequences. Particular classes and social groups are promoting and benefiting from this process. Investors, financial institutions, real estate developers, landlords, wealthy homeowners, and certain local and national politicians. The commodification of housing is also highly racialized and gendered. I mean, in general, we're seeing this process of change within the housing system reflect as well as amplify broader social inequality in the broadest way. So that in a very highly condensed nutshell is basically how the housing system in many places is changing. I mean, it sounds like an abstract process, but its consequences are extremely concrete and brutal for many households. It's causing precarity, insecurity, unaffordability, stress, and alienation for many households, and especially for working class and poor households. So let's just, for a moment, look at what it means to dwell in the commodity form. Look at how the commodification of housing is transforming cities and urban space. The most dramatic and visible manifestation of the commodification of housing is the emergence of new luxury developments of the sort with which we're all familiar. Certain areas of many global cities are being colonized by a fantasy-scape of sculpted glass and weathering steel. And many of these housing developments are not, they're really not housing at all. They're money congealed into tower form. This isn't housing made to be lived in. These are luxury objects meant to be circulated and exchanged. And proposals for new luxury housing are increasingly surreal and even grotesque. This is a logical outcome of built forms where being iconic is more important than being inhabitable. And I think it's clear that architecture here performs a very distinct ideological function. Architecture and the architecture of iconicity is trying to hide in plain sight what is a frankly anti-urban mode of spatial development. Entire new districts of cities are being shaped by global speculation. We're essentially seeing central sites in the heart of the urban realm being transformed into forbidden cities of financialization. And this is hollowing out urban life from the inside. You can't have a city that is only composed of luxury housing and only composed of housing for global elites, resident or non-resident. It simply won't work. And I think it's clear, especially to people in Vancouver, that this is the case. But I think it's also important to recognize that the impacts of commodification are not restricted to luxury housing. It's not just the formation of these sort of sculpted glass icons. The transformation of housing is also producing new cityscapes of dispossession. So if much of today's luxury housing is uninhabited, increasing amounts of housing for working class and poor people is uninhabitable. In a kind of mirror image of empty housing for the global elite, workers and their families are increasingly forced into overcrowded housing. And this is the case in cities across the world. At least 12%, and almost certainly more, of all rental housing in New York City is overcrowded. Overcrowding, both in private housing and in social housing in London, has reached the highest point in decades. And it tends to co-occur with under-maintenance, with building code violations, with exploitation, and with insecurity. I mean, housing of this sort is not only uncomfortable, but also fire-prone and dangerous. The uneven exposure to deadly risk is one of the hallmarks of today's urbanism. So some people are at risk of their tower catching fire in absolutely tragic ways. But this is an exposure to deadly danger that is incredibly uneven throughout today's urban realm. Housing strategies pursued by new financialized landlords also produce displacement, evictions, and insecurity as a matter of course. These are photographs of buildings in the Bronx in New York that were part of a portfolio of thousands of units purchased by a consortium of private equity firms. According to tenant organizers, these buildings were systematically undermaintained, with heat and hot water cut off, maintenance repairs unfixed, tenants harassed, threatened with evictions, buildings accruing hundreds of code violations and complaints. All the while, rents are being raised. What activists have termed predatory equity firms use a combination of debt and tenant harassment to squeeze profits out of every corner of the housing system. This is 621 Oneida Street in the Bronx, which was one of many rent-regulated buildings purchased by an investment firm in 2007. So according to tenant groups and to the city, this firm milked the building for all that it was worth. It subsequently went bankrupt. The building fell into foreclosure, and it sort of cycles through a series of owners, falling into an ever worse state of repair. So even foreclosure and bankruptcy don't provide ways out of the financialized circuit. There are strategies to deal with sort of luxury buildings and strategies to deal with buildings that are in foreclosure. And in neither cases are the sort of interests of inhabitants and of tenants being looked after. The archipelago of public housing in many cities, and especially in London, which had been built as sort of islands of partial decommodification, is now the perfect target for speculative investors seeking strategic investment locations. So, I mean, this is a famous council estate in East London. This chunk had been removed from it because it was going to be put into a sort of museum exhibition on the history of housing, but the rest of the estate is being destroyed. And so, I mean, it's a good example of something that is absolutely state-led and state-coordinated. So when people say, what can we as local or municipal government do? Well, the first thing you do is stop making the problem worse. Peter Marcuse and I use the term residential alienation to refer to the sense of precarity and insecurity that many households experience today. To experience residential alienation is to feel estranged from one's home. For many households, housing today is a major source of anxiety, interpersonal stress, and ill health. According to an English housing charity, 1 in 3 adults report that housing is causing stress and depression in their households. 1 in 4 report increased arguments with family members due to housing costs. I mean, in the UK, a lot of people are talking about a mental health crisis, and I think it's clearly deeply connected to the housing crisis. It needs to be seen as the psychosocial sort of consequence in many ways of the housing problem. Of course, many things contribute to this, but I think housing is certainly among them. So at many different scales, the logic of financialization is seeping into all corners of the housing system. It is operating at the scale of the planet, the scale of sort of global investment, and at the scale of the shared room or the subletted couch, where people need to adopt increasingly sort of individualized entrepreneurial relationships to their own housing. And in some ways, they're expected to sort of enjoy this process as well. By way of conclusion, let me briefly touch upon how households are pushing back. The history of housing movements shows that they come in waves, mobilizing in response to threats to residential space and dissipating as these threats are defeated or deferred. And we're clearly in a moment when a global wave of housing protest is on the rise. As much as we're living in an era of large-scale housing injustice, cities today are also still able to generate forces for radical transformation. Housing movements need to be considered as much an essential feature of contemporary housing systems as are real estate investment trusts or subletting platforms. Housing movements have sort of been part of the housing system ever since housing began to operate as a semi-distinct sector characterized by commodification. Over the years, housing activists have organized themselves in many different ways, adopting many different tactics, many different relationships to other political movements. They have spoken as tenants, as workers, as mortgage holders, as migrants, as women, as people of color, as public housing residents, and other subject positions within the housing hierarchy. What's important to know about today's housing struggles is that activists are organizing in defense of the idea of home, and in defense of the notion that housing can serve to meet the social need for housing and the social need for home. In this context of a commodified, financialized, increasingly neoliberal housing system. So for urban activists today, the commodification of housing presents a distinct set of challenges and political problems. How do you mobilize against landlords embedded within global finance? How can you demand municipal support for housing programs in the context of governments that are racked by austerity? In the early 20th century heyday of in an earlier heyday of housing movements in the early 20th century in cities like New York, tenant unions were up against local landlords who could potentially be outflanked. So tenant unions and other formations of housing movements developed a sort of panoply of tactics, from legally protected rent strikes to block captains to systematic eviction blocking. And it wasn't a fair fight between housing movements and real estate capital, but it was fairer than it is today. I mean, how can you organize against an organization like Blackstone Today, housing activists are up against a completely different scale, trying to demand changes from global landlords and from states that the global landlords wield great influence over. And they can't be pressured by local rent strikes or easily defeated in local courts, as landlords could in the past. So many housing activists still use classic examples of direct action and mutual aid, such as the group Focus E15 in London, which is a group of single mothers mobilizing against homelessness policies, and they also engage in eviction blocking. Or this group in New York, pictured here, Movement for Justice in El Barrio, who mix protest with direct action and mutual aid, sort of bringing, having picket lines and marches, but also bringing groceries to elderly residents on the upper floors of buildings when the elevators have been shut off, for example. So some activists have referred to actions of this sort with the term militant care. Today's housing activists are keenly aware of the ways in which the commodification of housing intersects with other urban political questions. So groups like the feminist anti-austerity group Sisters Uncut in London occupied an empty and soon-to-be-demolished council flat in Hackney in order to call attention to the ways that the housing crisis keeps some women in violent domestic arrangements. Other groups mobilize a new politics of data using citizen mapping and graphic design to help tenants understand how the abstract forces of financialization are reshaping their buildings, neighborhoods, and cities. As has long been the case, housing activism today needs to mobilize both with and against the state. So in some cases, defending housing policy against those seeking to marginalize it, and it's sometimes mobilizing against the capacity of states to wield housing policy for repressive ends. So I think this sort of speaks to the continuing contradictory nature of urban governance. But when housing becomes a globally circulating commodity, housing activism needs to scale up in order to become a truly global movement. This is a photograph from an International Day of Protest against Blackstone. This is in New York, but you see their signs are about Blackstone buying Spain. And so it was part of an ongoing effort to scale up so that housing movements can sort of match the global scale of real estate capital. Increasingly, the housing question today is the question of whether the housing system will function to meet the social need for home or function as a commodified site for profit making. It is increasingly clear that it can't be both. Today's techniques for investment are making cities unlivable for poor working class and growing numbers of middle class households as well. So between the uninhabited and the uninhabitable, the commodification of housing is cannibalizing the foundations of urban life. So far, the consequences of this process have been borne by the least powerful city dwellers, who are subject to difficult housing conditions, long commutes, and exposure to deadly risk. But increasingly, it's clear that the housing problem is undermining the political economic basis of many cities. I think that the commodification of cities and the explosion of inequality needs to be regarded as fundamentally anti-urban, as something that is eroding the urban experience at the sort of ground level. Certainly the least powerful city dwellers face the harshest versions of this, but urban life is produced collectively. So in a real sense, this is undermining the right to the city for everyone. I'll say, I think this is not something that urban thought or sort of architectural culture has really caught up with. Sort of read architecture critics in newspapers or go to exhibitions in museums. Many urbanists sort of still see the problems of urban life through a sort of hackneyed 20th century lens that thinks that modernist monotony and the great blight of dullness are the biggest threats to the urban experience. Whether or not this was ever a full picture of urban life is debatable, but I think it's clear that we need to develop a new common sense about cities and housing. Why is it basically second nature for urbanists and architects to see a cityscape like this as oppressive and alienating, but things like this are winning architectural awards? I think that architectural critics and urbanists need to start recognizing that the major problem with cities today is not oppressive modernism, it is oppressive precarity resulting from the growth of inequality and the commodification of urban space. Now, the main thing that I hope people take away from this is that none of this is inevitable. Housing, for most of its history, has not been a commodity, and it only becomes a commodity under certain conditions. The history of housing struggles shows that building residential alternatives is possible. Most people intuitively feel that homelessness is unjust, that unaffordable housing is unfair, and the support for the concept of the right to housing, and actually the existence of a formal legalistic right to housing is actually quite widespread. I mean, it's clear that a formal right to housing is not enough if it can coexist happily with housing injustice. So our challenge is to find ways to establish a radical right to housing. Activists and policymakers across the world are beginning to look at how to limit the commodity character of housing and reconnect housing to social citizenship. And this is something that I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. I don't think any city or country has quite managed to get this right so far, but there are a lot of movements in many places, and I think there's a broad political potential here. So I think we need a new approach to housing politics, one that responds to the needs of inhabitants and city dwellers rather than the needs of investors and speculators. What would the housing system look like if it was actually designed to meet the universal need for a home? If cities could stop reproducing the problem and start producing alternatives, we could begin to see some concrete answers to this question. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite Jen St Denis, the City Hall and Housing reporter for the Star Vancouver, for the rest of our evening, for the second part of our evening. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So as Andy said, I'm Jen St Denis. I write for the Star Vancouver. I cover housing mostly, also City Hall. But housing really that's where my obsession lies, and it has ever since 2015, which, as I'm sure all of you will remember, that's sort of when housing prices got really interesting and where kind of the conflicts in the city really started to rise. So I just thought I'd do a little bit of a kind of a recap over the past few years and what's gone on in our housing market, and then we're going to go to the next part of the evening where I'm going to invite our panelists up one by one. They're going to respond to what David said, and then we're going to open it up to you for questions. So do take a look at that Slido app, and we already have a lot of great questions, including one that was directed to Andy. Somebody asked about if he was going to run for mayor, so yeah, I knew that would embarrass him. I don't know what we started, Andy. Who knows where it will lead? Okay, so I'm just going to take us back just a few years, just to 2015. I know housing has been really crazy and exciting and the topic of many dinner conversations before that, but I didn't want to go back too far. I just wanted to remind everybody that at that time, the news at the time was filled with stories of homeowners who had cashed in and they'd gotten sort of fabulously wealthy, or at least made themselves quite a little nest egg, just by selling the family home that they'd bought, a few decades ago, and they were able to kind of go off and live on Vancouver Island and live off their investments for the rest of their lives. Well, isn't that nice? But there was also a lot of anger building at the time, and I just wanted to remind people of the rally in June 2015, when a lot of mostly young people came to the Vancouver Art Gallery, and they held a protest, and it was the nerdiest rally I've ever been to because the signs they held up said, "Give us more data." And the data that they wanted was some sort of measure specifically of how much money from outside of Canada was landing in the Vancouver housing market, which could possibly explain this huge gap that was forming between incomes and housing prices. So we all know what happened next. There kind of was like a ball rolling down the hill. Home prices just rose more and more and more. By June 2016, home prices had risen by 40% in some communities year over year. And a more normal rate would be something like 2% in other communities. So it was getting really, really crazy. And the BC Liberals, I remember, did this amazing turnaround where I remember going to a Mike DeYoung press conference, and he was saying, "Oh, we're absolutely not going to touch the housing market. We want to protect people's equity." 2 months later, they were introducing the foreign buyer tax. And then there was public outrage that led to political change. And so we saw a lot of changeover in the provincial. We saw a change in the provincial government. We also saw a lot of change in the most recent municipal election. And that's brought in a slew of new policies. And so the NDP raised the foreign buyer tax. They also brought in a slew of other taxes that were all aimed at speculation. And so now in 2019, we're sort of sitting at a different point in the housing market. What we're seeing is housing prices dropping quite a lot, in fact. And so my most recent story was about a homeowner in West Vancouver who hoped to kind of capitalize on those rising home prices. They built a new house, borrowed a lot of money from the bank, went on the market in August 2016, $6.5 million I hope to get for it. Well, today it's still sitting on the market. It's priced at $3.9 million. It's assessed at 3.4. It's a great bargain. And the bank owns the house, so that homeowner did not get to reap any of the equity that he'd lived in the house for 40 years. If you're interested in reading that story, we are doing a subscription drive. You can find it on thestar.com. Those stories that David Madden was telling about evictions, about mental health, really were striking home for me because over the past 5 or 6 months, I've been writing story after story of tenants who have been rent-evicted, this thing that happens to mostly to older people who have lived in their apartments for years. And a lot of the people I've been talking to have been made sick, have gone to hospital because the stress of the eviction has exacerbated health conditions. And I talked recently to a single mother and her teenage son who'd been made homeless for several months. They weren't living right on the street, but they didn't have a home for several months. And that's because the rising home prices in 2016 also filtered over into the rental market. Sort of for the first time, the rental market was really followed what was happening in home prices. And so rents have risen at 13% between 2016 and now. And we all know, of course, as well, that we've also seen a rise in homelessness. And so we're struggling to deal with that as well. So we've really seen the impacts kind of flow out into all different aspects of society. And it's hard sometimes to talk to people about their eviction and to wonder why that had to happen. You know, why it was so necessary to push that 69-year-old person who's already struggling with brain injury to kind of just push them right out of their house. Okay, so I'm going to call up our first panelist now. Our first panelist is Penny Gerstein. She's a professor and immediate past director of the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC. She specializes in the socio-cultural aspects of community planning with particular emphasis on those who are the most marginalized in planning processes. Her current research is investigating strategies for affordable home ownership and rental housing, both internationally and in Canada, and she is the founding director of the Housing Research Collaborative.
So thank you. I actually don't have much in terms of responding to what David has, because I actually agree with what he's saying. So what I'm going to do is actually try to locate it in Vancouver and actually show how I'm seeing there is some small glimmers of sort of some hope here. I'm seeing it. I never saw it a few years ago, but I do see it now. The reason, and David, I think, really sort of so evocatively sort of described how the consequences of our current housing crisis is and internationally, and how it's affecting people's lives so dramatically. I really got into and started focusing on housing when I did a longitudinal study over 3 years of single parents on income assistance. And there was a group of us, and we interviewed people every 6 months and really did a trajectory of their lives. And over that course of 3 years, you could just see such a dramatic difference between the people who had secure, affordable, safe housing and those that didn't. And I really thought, I saw that, how critical housing was to people's lives then. And I really thought, we have to do something. And so why I'm seeing such a glimmer now, a glimmer of hope here, is that I think there are some, things that are congruent in Canada, and particularly in BC, that is hopefully allowing us to start addressing some of the issues that have been brewing for sort of decades. And it isn't just, and it wasn't just the escalation of the housing prices. It has been, and probably David will talk about this more, it has been the lack of government, any government, real government attention to housing, except for home ownership, supporting home ownership. And that's really occurred since the mid-1990s. There's just been nothing in there. So right now, without the political will, really there is this window of opportunity, I just really think would go to naught. But what are those what are the patterns that I'm seeing now? First of all, the federal government has said it is back at the table, and I believe them, I hope so. The National Housing Strategy and the federal allocated funds towards housing, though not nearly enough, provides funding for province to match for affordable housing. And a province like BC, who actually has had, it has a number of, that it's built up its capacity to be really using that money, I think is in a good position. Because of the fact that it has BC Housing that has been building housing and has been partnering with others. Second, since the 1990s, when the federal government stopped almost all programs other than those focusing on home ownership, the nonprofit housing sector, now called the community housing sector, has become more sophisticated in the delivery and management of nonprofit housing. So that even though it's only 5% of the housing in Canada, they have really done their yeoman's kind of work in trying to address the kind of critical housing needs for those people that really need it. And third, there is a diverse range of partnerships that has evolved that includes those from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, as well as faith-based communities and financial institutions such as credit unions. And what resulted is some very innovative projects that really illustrate what is possible when these sectors work together. And there's actually one project that I think is really demonstrates the kind of ability when you start thinking out of the box, is the Community Land Trust project that is going to be hopefully completed in July 2019, but now there's also other community land trust projects that are being proposed, which include, again, partnerships, but it also is a way of providing affordability into perpetuity because of the fact that the land is out of the equation to some extent. So, and citizens are also pushing back. And I think Jen mentioned the protests in 2015. I don't know if you remember, but there was a very brave young woman who started something called the she just sent out a hashtag, I don't have $1 million, and it somehow catalyzed a group, and there was some real interest in 2015 recognizing there's something really wrong here and we have to do something. And I really do feel it led to the transformation of the Vancouver City Council at this recent election, because now we have a council, that has different points of view, and hopefully we'll be able to come up with some more that's a way of addressing housing in a more nuanced way than what has been done before. So all of the key elements outlined above are strong in BC currently. But that doesn't mean that we are anywhere near the amount of affordable housing we need to meet the demand. I mean, we right now, Social housing is at 5%. If we were actually going to be addressing all of the demand for people who need social housing and for the people, the working poor and even the middle class families, it would be about 30% that we would have to actually be building. And we need to meet the demand of the homeless and working families and others. And so currently we really are not building housing that is meeting the needs of our citizens. So how do we ensure that we do meet these needs? We need to have really, we need to have nuanced conversations. And that may sound very weak and everything, but I'd say it needs to be within forums like this. It needs to be within neighborhoods, it needs to be within cities, it needs to be within provinces. We need to have nuanced conversations about how we allocate public assets, such as our land. I mean, the critical issue in Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland was the escalation of the housing prices. The buildings were worth nothing. It's the land. I mean, the land that is really. And so we need to be thinking about that. We have enormous public assets right now, and we are not really having those kinds of conversations on how we can be using that land, both in cities and in crown lands in other places. So we need those kinds of conversations. We need to start seeing housing as part of a delivery system, and David mentioned that, but I think you need to be thinking at it as a whole system, that you're looking from delivering and supporting housing for people who are homeless to people who may need support in getting into home ownership. And so how would you do that? You would need to develop policies and programs that would support the right balance of housing tenures, such as rental, ownership, co-op, social housing, the right balance of built form and location. Where do we locate suburban and urban, apartment, townhouse, detached housing, the right balance of cost and type of relative to local earnings. I mean, the critical issue in Vancouver that we're battling with right now is that the cost of housing is totally decoupled from incomes. And so how do you find that balance between that? And this is all, this is all needed to address the imbalances in the housing markets affecting population health, social relations, and economic stability. So rather than having real estate be the main economic driver of our city, which it has been for decades now, we need to be thinking about how do you provide affordable, safe, adequate housing for people so that they can use that to move forward in their lives and also be able to create economic opportunities for them. Right now, we're hollowing out. We don't have housing for service workers. We don't have, there's all of the young people have to leave, so that we're not allowing those creative people to be actually generating the kinds of economic and social activity that we need to create a thriving community. So finally, we need a politics of compassion in addressing housing. And that might sound, again, a little bit wishy-washy, but I do think that we need to be thinking about not just ourselves in the housing question. We need to be thinking about the whole community, and how if you have a community that thrives, then you will thrive. So seeing affordable, adequate, and safe housing as a right for all, rather than as an asset for the few, is what we should be aiming for. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce our next panelist. It's David Hilchansky. He's a professor of housing and community development at the University of Toronto, where he holds the Chow Yeh Ching Chair in Housing. He holds a PhD in urban planning, and his research and teaching focus on housing, neighborhoods, and community development.
Thank you, Jen. Wow. Good evening. It's good to be back. Some of you will know I taught at UBC in the 1980s in the School of Planning. Those of you who did your homework and read David's book, you will have noticed that in chapter 1, the third paragraph states, you remember it, right? Real estate is attacking housing. Think about that. Real estate is attacking housing. And what David means by it, I'm sure, is the housing system is attacking housing. We have a housing system, right, that's not fit for purpose any longer. Imagine having a healthcare system that attacks our health. I think that's happening in the United States, right? There's 10, 20, or 30% of Americans, well, go die. You don't have the money to pay for the healthcare and all that. So we have a housing, and what should a housing system do? It's pretty simple. 3 things, right? Produce enough housing, but in producing housing, produce a mix of housing so that there can be housing choice. That's tenure, owning, renting, cooperatives, location, size, quality, and so on, right? And then third is assist those who can't afford adequate, appropriate housing. So it should be a minority who cannot afford it because the housing system should be serving almost everybody. And no system will ever be perfect, so we help some people that way. Now, to some extent, we used to do that up until the 1990s. And what happened in the 1990s is the growth of income inequality, very dramatic growth in income inequality. All those tax cuts and program cuts and so on meant that more and more people were no longer, we didn't have that big middle income group any longer. Okay, we were a majority middle income group up until the 1990s. We were actually becoming slightly more equal from the 40s to the 80s, and then we reversed that very dramatically in the 1990s. So our housing system up until the 1990s was doing a number of things. Most people forget that almost all purpose-built rental housing, private sector rental housing in this country, was subsidized up until 1984. There was a stream of subsidies from 1947, 48, limited dividend program, the assisted rental program, MERBs, people know these names who have been around in the business. We made sure there was private sector rental supply, and we made sure there was public and then eventually nonprofit and nonprofit co-op supply also. That ended in the early 1990s. So we were doing a variety of things, and in fact, when we look at the data, we were spending up to close to 2% of our federal government budget on the housing system. Okay, this is just subsidies to poor people. This is getting private sector rental built and a whole variety of things like that. And we were building 20,000 or so public housing and then nonprofit housing units per year for a couple decades. We stopped doing all that by the 1990s. So what is our housing system? As David's been pointing out, it's not a system that is building or supplying housing as a place to live. But the way I summarize it, and some of my colleagues, is that our housing system is a mechanism for increasing wealth and income inequality. So what else is it doing these days? Increasing wealth for a few, right? And massively increasing inequality. And for those lucky people who bought a house 30 years ago, okay, if they have kids, they can pass something on to their kids, which also increases income inequality, if you will, that way too, because if you rent, you don't have an option, or you bought recently, and so on. So what's the root cause of all this problem? Again, it's income inequality. And so you hear economists and others talk about, again, economics 101, supply and demand. Well, we need supply. No, our problem is we don't have effective market demand. Remember, effective market demand, that means enough people with enough money in their pockets to afford what the housing system is providing, because it's not, right? It used to do that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but no longer. So the problem really is this effective market demand. and to have a housing system that does the three things it should be doing, and it's not doing those things. So David talked about regulations, financialization, the globalization of housing, and that's the problem, but it's also the solution of regulations. A few have been introduced in British Columbia, and probably this province is doing more than any province. And again, financialization, who owns what? We are one of the most secretive countries in the world. It's harder to get a library card, it is often said, than to buy, sell, trade, real estate, and so on. So we know what to do. We used to do it well. And there is one key institution that has created a housing system, sets the rules of the game for a housing system. Is what is that? That's us, right? It's our levels of government. It's the state. Federal, provincial, local government sets the rules of the game. And since the 1990s, we've been doing everything that David told us about there. So yes, we need these housing movements, right? And we have to be more active. Imagine if people before Tommy Douglas, and Tommy Douglas himself and his colleagues, and then all the people since Tommy Douglas didn't do what they did for our healthcare system, right? We would be like the United States maybe, or something like that. But anyways, we have a healthcare system that is not attacking health, but we have a housing system that is indeed attacking housing, that is attacking housing as a place to live, as a place to raise a family, and so on. And finally, don't forget the environmental, the climate change part of this, right? All the resources that go into all these buildings that are mainly empty. But then people have to commute longer distances, right, to come here and work and all that. So it's a whole mess. And I know more people are having a better understanding of this, as has been pointed out here. And we have to just keep on with this struggle, because we can change things. We're still a democracy, and we have to chase after all our three levels of government to deal with these issues. So I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, well, speaking of government, our final panelist is Selena Robinson. She's the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. She was elected as MLA for Coquitlam-Maillardville in 2013 and re-elected in 2017. As a former city councillor, Selena fought to protect the health of children and families by introducing a local ban on cosmetic pesticides and worked to improve access for people with disabilities as chair of the Coquitlam Universal Accessibility Advisory Committee. Please come join us, Selena.
That stool that was here was for me so that you can see me at the back. So first of all, that's a good idea. Better? Well, first of all, I want to thank Andy for inviting me and for inviting all of us and for hosting all of us here. I think it's really important that we continue these kinds of conversations. So thank you very much for having us all here. I want to just take a moment to operationalize the problem, and I realize that what we heard here was a lot of description about the problem, and I understand that as the Minister of Housing, it's my responsibility to fix it. So I want to thank you all for all of your wonderful suggestions. I was a city councillor with the city of Coquitlam. I got elected in 2008, and I remember coming before me in council. It was about 2010, 2011. And the developers were coming forward fast and furious because apparently the Evergreen line was coming, and it did come. But it wasn't there yet, and there was a lot of activity around the Coquitlam City Centre. And the developers were coming in fast and furious, and they were building very tall buildings in suburban Metro Vancouver out in Coquitlam. And I remember asking them, because we would look at the buildings and look at the access and egress and, talk about parks and take a look at, how many units, what size. And the whole building, the 22 stories, was going to be 500 to 800 square foot apartments. And I remember saying to the developers, like, who are you building for? Like, where are the families going to live? And they would say, and it wasn't any one developer, they would always say, well, it's the market demand. And I would say, like, but who? Who are you talking about? And they were saying, well, they're selling. It's like entry level. This is what we would be told. And of course they would sell. Their pre-sales would go through the roof, and they would build this building. And then a couple of years later, I remember I was a volunteer for Operation Red Nose, where you take drunk people home in their cars. You're not drunk, they are. And you park them in their underground parking lot in their tower that is right by the SkyTrain station. And driving this one woman home, my husband was driving our car, and I was with the woman in her car. I was one driving, she was drunk. And she said, well, can you go into the underground? That way my car is parked. And then my husband followed us. I got into the car. She gave us donation money for the local charity that we were raising money for. And as we went into the underground, and I looked around, and there were 3 levels of parking, and there were like almost no cars. And I turned to her and I said, where is everybody? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. It's a Saturday night, I know, but it's sleepy Coquitlam. They're not all out partying. And she said, it's always like this. There was nobody living there. We have, in Coquitlam, safety deposit boxes in the sky and single-family homes that were mostly built between the 50s and the 70s. Some of them are getting torn down. And in their stead, they're building what I call castles, 8,000 and 12,000 square foot homes on large lots. So those are the 2 kinds of housing choices you have in my community. And so this has been going on for a long time, and it really felt like when I was seeing it that no one was listening to what was going on. And I'm just grateful that we're to be part of a government that is listening. Because when we talk about housing, we talk about housing for people. We put people into the center of every single decision. And so I'm continuing to work with staff when we talk about how much housing, that we don't talk about units. It's not units of housing. They're homes. They're homes where people are going to be living their lives. They're homes where people are going to be making important life choices. They're homes where people are going to be taking care of their ill family members. They're homes where they're going to bring home their newborn children. That we need to remember that this is about people who live in British Columbia who need homes, and that's what our focus is as a government. So I want to let you know that there's a number of things that we've been doing, and we have inherited a very difficult and challenging and complex problem, and it's not going to be easy to resolve quickly, but it is something that we're prepared to address. And so we put forward a 30-point plan. And just to let you know that it has sort of 3 different buckets of actions that are helping to address our housing crisis that we have here. And I want to express gratitude to David for the book. I did read it, mostly because I take transit everywhere, and it's a great place to catch up on your reading. But it was really helpful for me, as a housing minister responsible for housing crisis in British Columbia, to see that it's happening everywhere. And so that I am not alone and the only housing minister that has to deal with it. So I'm going to be asking you to hook me up with all the other housing ministers. But with a 30-point plan, it means that we can address this problem from many different angles, because it's not any one thing that is going to fix this. There's no magic pill. So we have significant number of actions that are about addressing demand. And we've put in a number of taxes and understanding who's owning these homes and how are they getting flipped, and tracking, making sure that they're paying their fair share of taxes. That's really important, and that work continues, mostly through the Minister of Finance, but that is the work that we're doing, and it's starting to have an effect. The speculation tax, the additional school tax, and the foreign buyers tax. The other thing that we're doing is taking a look at supply, and I've certainly heard from many people in the industry, oh, it's just a supply problem. It is not a supply problem. We have been so busy building. It is a right supply program. We're not building the right supply. Like in my community, we've got the safety deposit boxes in the sky and big single-family homes that my son reminds me that I'm in and I'm overhoused. Yes, honey, I know. But those are my only choices. I have no place to downsize in my community. None. So we need to make sure we're getting the right supply. So one of the things that we did, and it's really geeky, so all the data people in the room, I want you to pay close attention. I'm going to give you more data. We have said to all local governments, and Andy's so excited, we've said to all local governments, you need to do a housing needs assessment every 5 years. Because I remember what it was like having these proposals come at me, staff doing a great job of representing the proposal, but I had no basis, I had no data that would tell me, is this the right kind of housing in our community? What kind of housing do we need? Who are we saying yes to housing for? Are we having a lot of downsizers in our community? Do we need a lot of seniors housing? What about young families? What kind of housing do we need? So now every local government in this province is going to have to do a housing needs assessment. 50 data points, Andy, 50 data points. So they're all the same, so now, and they will all be made public, so that's part of the requirement, is every local government will have to be putting that out publicly, so that the private sector, the community housing sector, can all take a look and see what's needed going forward, what's the anticipated need, so they can respond accordingly. The local decision makers know exactly what their housing needs are. And as a province, we could take a look at all the data, regionally and right across this province, to identify and anticipate what kind of housing we're going to need going forward so that we can put things in place, because I never want to be in this housing crisis again. Now, the other thing that we've done is we've put together a $7 billion fund over the next 10 years to build the kind of housing that people need. And it's everything from people who are homeless to middle incomes. And we recognize that there are some real challenges. So we're putting in social housing, or we're making the largest single investment in this province's history into social housing. The third bucket of actions that we're doing has to do with fairness in the residential tenancy system. That we recognize that the residential tenancy branch has been sorely underfunded. There was never a compliance unit put in place, so the chronic abusers, whether it's renters or landlords, weren't ever penalized. And so we put some systems in place to make sure that we can get a fairer system, to make sure that rent evictions didn't happen and that people had an opportunity to stay in their homes. So we're continuing to do that work on that. That work is ongoing. The last thing I want to mention that Penny talked about, and that was partnerships. We are not going to, as a provincial government, get out of this on our own. It's just impossible. But neither is anybody else going to be able to do it on their own. And that's why we have to work together. And from day one, our government has said we're going to do this in partnerships. And I want to tell you that I'm hopeful too. And I'm hopeful not just because I think we're a government that I know we're a government that puts people in the center of every decision that we make. I'm hopeful because wherever I go and I do a conversation about housing, people say, how can we help? And that includes the private sector, the community housing sector, Indigenous communities, faith-based communities. The Royal Legions have put together a development arm because they want to participate with us in identifying ways to address housing for people, homes for people. And so everywhere I go, there are others who want to join with us and make sure that we are delivering for the people of British Columbia, because our children depend on it, our seniors who want to age in place and with dignity depend on it, because our workforce depends on it. And as I talked even with the private development sector around some of the challenges that they have presented and that they continue to present, I had an interesting phone call today, I may or may not talk about that, talking about the commodification of housing. But when I challenge them, they do come around. And there are some wonderful stories of people, I want to say, in the private sector. There's one developer from Richmond who was doing a project in Port Moody, and he decided on his own, it's actually his kids, his adult kids, who said, Dad, why don't we just do a rent-to-own program and see what happens? And so they did that. And he took a bit of a hit on it. And he saw what the demand was. And he said, you know, we can do more of these. And so there's some creativity and innovation, and it's coming from all parts. And so I'm really grateful to be the Minister of Housing in this auspicious time. And I look forward to working with all of you as citizens to help reestablish a housing system that works for everybody. Thank you.
Okay.
I heard nothing about accessible, affordable housing in all platforms. I would like to hear something about accessibility in all platforms, whether it's buy-to-own own rent or whatever. A lot of people who did work hard and all the rest can only be in social housing because that's the only accessible. It should be all around. And I've heard too many times that people have been allowed to make housing without making it somewhat universally accessible. And then after 5 years, they don't have to have it accessible. I would like to see whether one lives there permanently or not, how they be able to be from birth to death to be able to be accessible for anyone, whether they have disabled children, whether they live alone or whatever, but they can live where they want and have access from birth to death, to even having help stay there.
Okay, I think we understand your question.
Sorry about that, but none of you have addressed that. And I would like you to address it in a universal level from London and New York.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
But that is important because of the majority of people becoming seniors.
Right.
Also, a lot of people being disabled.
Okay. Let's take a stab at answering the question. Does anyone want to start with that? There's a microphone right there.
Oh, they didn't hear the
So, okay. So we have an audience member asking about accessibility in housing, about aging in place, about housing being flexible enough to accommodate people when they have different needs. So what about that question? It's certainly something that can lengthen waiting lists on social housing and
it shouldn't just be in social housing. I think that was the point here. It should be in all housing, and I think that's an excellent point. And it is one that we're continuing to look at, and I know that the National Building Code is looking at that, and we're certainly looking at that in the BC Building Code to make sure that we have the kind of flexibility and adaptability in all of our homes so that we can age in place, because the reality is most of us will have some sort of disability at some point in our lifetime, and we shouldn't have to move because of that, that our homes should be places where we can adapt, that can be adapted to whatever our physical needs are.
Thank you for that. That's an excellent question and an excellent point. And I'll just add that I think that the type of housing that is being produced in a lot of cities today, sort of following the patterns that we've been discussing, has an incredibly narrow sense of what a household is. And doesn't speak to the range of differences that you find in basically every household. Yeah. As well, the spaces that households with members who have disabilities need are being sort of reclassified as surplus by lots of local and national governments. In the UK, there was an incredibly oppressive tax that has been created called the bedroom tax that penalizes families living in social housing that are said to be under-occupying their housing. But having a sort of extra room in their house is a necessity for many households and for many people with disabilities and for many people with the sort of whole range of family models. So I mean, I absolutely agree with your point, and I think that the sort of reduction of sort of the whole range of possible housing types to just one or two models is another insidious consequence of the processes that we've been discussing.
Okay, so we're going to take a question from the Slido platform. So again, if you want to download it on your phone, it's SLIDO. The password, or whatever you would call it, is home for this event. Okay, so the first question I'm going to take from the platform is, do you have thoughts on restricting property purchases to residents, limiting global speculation? New Zealand recently introduced this policy, and it seems to be successful there. David, would you like to
start? Thank you for that, Internet, or whatever that app is. Dan, thank you, Dan. No, it's a very good. It's a very good point. It is something that different countries and municipalities and states and provinces and whatnot are trying to address in different ways. I'm not not seen any model that people have sort of generally agreed has worked, because creating a policy like this is quite difficult, and I think it's a challenge to draw a line between inhabitants and sort of domestic inhabitants and those who are buying houses that they're not inhabiting. It's a continuum, and so I think it's something that it's a sort of working problem space. But I mean, I think that the general principle of establishing inhabitants and residents and households at the center of housing practice basically says that there should be no place for people purchasing housing simply as investments that they're not going to live in.
Do any of the panelists really want to take a stab at that question? We're running a little short of time, so I'm going to move to some more questions. Okay, so I did want to tackle the dreaded supply question. Oh, sorry, it just disappeared. When does supply matter? And how do you balance the need for more housing, especially social housing, and rampant NIMBYism? Selena. All right, go for it. They're so polite, they must be Canadian.
I mean, and I think that this has been reiterated several times by different people. It isn't the supply. We have supply. What it is that the demand is not meeting the supply. We have a different that we don't. We're not actually. There's an incongruity between the two, between demand and supply. So we do need a certain kind of supply, and we don't have an understanding and a real gauge on that, and that's why there's this crisis right now, because people are being pushed out who are part of the demand that are not being met. So.
Well, and I do want to say that everyone in this room has a role to play around some of the pushback that local governments get. And having been in local government where you're looking to do, and I'll just give you an example, on a bus route, there was single-family homes. There was a rapid, one of those quick buses that goes down all the time. I'm losing my words. Express bus, thank you, express bus. And they wanted to put townhouses. The developer wanted to put townhouses. So going from single family to townhouse, so three single families to I think 8 or 10 townhomes, which was really nice, gentle density. And the neighborhood lost their mind. And they came out in droves, and the council did not support it. I wasn't on council at the time. I would have absolutely supported it. But the council did not support it. But there was no one there to say, yes, I want that in my neighborhood. And so it's really important that people go out to public hearings and let your local government officials know how important these projects are to you and to your family, and get your friends out and their friends out, because that's really the role as citizens in making sure that your voices are heard.
I just very, very briefly on this. I mean, I think that there is a fundamental problem with this framing, which is that markets only respond to effective demand, but the need for housing is universal. So the market mechanism will never be a good way to craft a housing system. I mean, certainly there is a shortage of many types of housing. There's also a surplus of many types in many places. I mean, I think that if we're going to talk about the supply problem, clearly the most pressing supply problem is the lack of social and public housing in every place. I've yet to meet or yet to sort of encounter an urban district that doesn't have a massive waiting list for social housing. So as far as I'm concerned, that is the supply problem that we should be talking about.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about social housing and what we call social housing. This question comes by way of my colleague at the Vancouver Sun, Dan Famano, who wrote about this. The City of Vancouver has a social housing initiative, but 60% of the units that are being created are actually for households earning $50,000 and above. So is this affordability? Do you want to tackle that first, David?
Sure. Yeah, the concept, the very term affordable housing across the globe is a deeply ideological and mystifying one. I mean, in London, affordable housing is a label applied to housing priced at 80% of market rates. I mean, housing is insanely expensive. 80% of insanely expensive is still extremely expensive. So you can't, you simply can't say, oh, look, we're meeting our housing needs because we have developers off-site have supplied a certain amount of affordable housing. So, I mean, I think that the term itself is misleading and unhelpful and not a good way to understand the housing problem.
Okay, the next question, I want everyone to take a stab at answering this because I think it's a really interesting question. And David Holchansky, because you haven't been talking a lot, I want you to start. So get ready. How do you persuade powerful actors like the state to reimagine the role housing plays in society?
I forget which American politician, was it Roosevelt or somebody, one of them said, make me do it, right? I agree with you, but make me do it. And I actually had a meeting in the 1990s with a liberal cabinet minister, and because we didn't know each other, he sort of spoke in code, and at one point he said, well, where's the NDP? This is a liberal minister saying, where's the NDP on this? In other words, meaning not enough that he agrees with me. He didn't want to say it that way. And not that I was representing the NDP at all, but he was just saying there isn't enough pressure on me to do what I agree should be done, but others in the cabinet are not doing it. So we're in a democracy, and either people who seem to be thinking similar ways in this room do more, right, act as active citizens, or people in other places will do what they're doing, in, like in Ontario, this sort of fluke where we get a Donald Trump-like premier, okay? I mean, there's this whole series of accidents, if you will, just like Trump sort of is too, how he ended up there, okay? So there is strong movements that want to oversimplify this and blame other people, whether it's immigrants or poor people or whatever. And we have to make our politicians do what needs to be done. It's a democracy.
What he said.
Really? That's it?
But it's true. I mean, you know, the expectations that we'll be leaders, and I think we do our best, but the reality is we answer to you. You the people, the citizens, you determine who is going to represent you and make decisions on your behalf. So it really is, from my perspective, up to the public to continue to remind us about what's important and what they expect of their politicians, so that we make the right decisions on your behalf. And I certainly heard loud and clear in this last election that housing was the most important issue in this province. And I heard it everywhere, not just in Metro Vancouver, even though we're all sort of what I'd say Metro-centric, but I have been traveling this province, and I want to tell you it's a problem in Queen Charlotte, and it's a problem in Burns Lake, and it's a problem in Kamloops, and it's a problem in Prince George. It is everywhere. It is not just here. It's the most acute here, but it is everywhere. It's on the island. People are feeling the pressure, and it is the commodification, I think, of housing that has really become a real challenge. And it is up to us, all of us, to redefine and remember that housing is our homes first and foremost.
Yeah, I think right now we have a very narrow range of options, or we see a very narrow range of options in trying to address housing. And I think we need to be widening that range of options and really be sort of thinking other ways. I think, even though I know you were saying don't be idealistic about the 1970s or something like that. But there were a few more range of options then, co-op housing, other kinds of experiments that we need to be introducing, because I don't think people actually really know what can be done to address the housing. And there are things, but they have to be actually exposed to that in some ways. I mean, and definitely it is, I think that people have to be very active in this, and I think it has to start from the neighborhoods. I think you have, the neighborhoods. One of the things that I think is really good about places like the Lower Mainland is I do think it does have strong neighborhoods. Vancouver has very strong neighborhoods, and I think that allowing the kinds of discussions and dialogues to go on at that level, to sort of be looking at what's possible, I think is really powerful.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I wasn't trying to scoff at the history of alternative tenures throughout urban history, but I think there's a lot of political potential in housing as an issue in general, and I think that political parties in many countries are starting to realize that this is the #1 issue for many people, and it takes a lot of different forms. I mean, many people vote for the Labour Party in the UK because of the housing question, even though it doesn't have a particularly great position on housing. I mean, some people voted for Brexit because they thought it would sort of solve the housing problem. So it's expressed in many different ways. And I think it's an issue that's sort of waiting to be productively mobilized in the political sphere. But the boundaries, and I completely agree with Penny that there's so many more possible sort of options in terms of housing policy, but the boundaries of housing politics are policed very clearly and very strongly, and it's always sort of transformed into a technical problem, an economic problem, sometimes a sort of architectural or design problem, but it's never really politicized as broadly as it should be. And that's because if you start addressing the housing problem as broad as it is, and if you start seeing housing politics in their sort of fullest form, you very quickly start needing to ask fundamental questions about class, about inequality, about racism, about patriarchy, about ableism, about all sorts of issues that people generally don't want to talk about. And so it's a potentially explosive issue that gets at the heart of the way cities and communities operate today, and gets at fundamental questions about inequality. For that reason, sort of in the political sphere, it's always narrowed to sort of palatable bites. But I think that there's political energy surrounding housing that is sort of waiting to be harnessed well.
Okay, I know we could go on talking about this all night long, but we have come to the end of our time. And so I hope you'll join me in thanking our wonderful panelists and David Madden for his lecture. Thank you.